Thank you. I think we're going to take questions from the floor. In order to give everybody a fair chance, could I ask questions to be brief? I'll have to cut you off if they are too long. And could you also very briefly introduce your name and where you're from as well? Sir, over here.
My name is Nabil Al-Haidawi. I am Iraqi writer, lecturer and researcher, University of London. My question to Aram. I think that still those who are criminals from Ba'ath Party, they are in the power, and even Noor al-Maliki, Prime Minister, used them in Amaliyat Baghdad, and they are advisors to the Maliki. And we see what happens in Kirkuk. He used militia against Kurd, and he wants to use F-16 against the Kurd. So what's your opinion to solve this problem? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Nabil, for your question. I mentioned just briefly the mission didn't complete. When they created the Iraqi High Tribunal, they tried many cases, and there are still many other cases awaiting for a trial. So the intention of the Iraqi government, I said, they didn't continue with that intention. For example, last year they tried to close the tribunal. We went to Baghdad, we hasted basically, we went to Baghdad, and they continued the tribunal, but they haven't reactivated any of the works. We send our delegation to Baghdad on a frequent basis, but there's no intention now. That's one. Regarding the current situation, I mentioned that you are aware of the realities now on the ground. Still, they are using military forces, they mobilize military forces for solving internal issues. So that's a strong indication. Also, I mentioned that there's still rumors of chemical weapons in the area. So the solution basically would be, there's a solution. The solution is they need to recognize what happened. They need to basically have the positive intention to solve the problem, to recognize genocide, to compensate the victims, and to work closely with the KRG, with the Kurdish people, to live in peace. So at the end, I mentioned we have hope, but we need to have that from them, intention from Iraq to live in peace and solve all the problems peacefully in political ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, lady in the front with the purple. Thank you.
My name is Margaret Owen. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I'm also the director of an international organization, Widows for Peace Through Democracy. I haven't heard, thank you so much for all these very moving speeches, but we haven't heard enough, I think, about the survivors, who are often the widows and the wives of the disappeared, who even now, so long after the genocide, are living in incredible poverty with huge health problems, and they need to have their voices heard. And when you talked about the international mechanisms, there's also UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which actually says that all governments and everybody involved in conflict resolutions and reconciliations must hear the voices of women. And I'd just like to hear from some of you how we can help to support the widows and wives of the disappeared so that they have their voices heard and their rights.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Could I ask perhaps Professor Stansfield if you'd like to answer that?
Yes, thank you. Is this working? Okay, thank you. You're quite right. I mean, some of the most distressing sites in Kurdistan in the 1990s were in the collective settlements, the so-called victory camps, where many of these women who'd had their menfolk removed and eradicated were placed. And there were thousands of female-headed, single female-headed households in these collective settlements, living barely above the poverty line, if at all. I think over the years, through different humanitarian aid programs, through the increased efficiencies of the KRG, through increased knowledge of the plight of these people, that the situation slowly improved. But it still remains the case that there remain significant components of Kurdish society that are victims from the period of the genocide and from the removal of tens of thousands, if not more, people that remain. The livelihood, their viability remains deeply in question. It's an improved situation, improved story, but certainly not one that's been resolved.
Tom, I think, is going to make a comment.
I mean, generally speaking, and I always remember the first time I came across this phenomenon, which was a place called Kush Tepe, where the entire township was inhabited by widows and mothers who had lost children. But I just want to bring up one point, saying that it is slow. I also remember that, and this is another example of what I call collective, selective amnesia by the international community. I remember, especially during the early 90s, through different organizations, we tried to get severely injured, gas injured and other injured people out, ones who were actually, you know, even teenagers, I remember, out of Iraq at that time to get them proper treatment. And this was a terrible job to do, because no one wanted to recognize them, no one really wanted to take responsibility. So, and I say this without shame, we were reduced, a group of us, some of us, to in fact going as far as creating false passports for them, you know, I think it was $500 a time, and sneaking them across the Turkish border. But you talk about, you know, even some of the so-called nastiest people in this. There was a rather nice story I remember of, we got one boy across who was really, in fact, Bayan has his records, we got him across, but his passport wasn't quite good enough. So when we got to the border, the Turkish official looked at my passport and looked at his, and he said, "You can go, Mr. Tom. This one, next time you make it better." And he let us go.
Okay.
Or else, you know, we could have been in a Turkish choky to this day. But this underlies a serious thing, that this lack of recognition isn't just about the dead and about compensation. It's about people who still need urgent help now. And until that recognition is fully on the books, we're always going to be facing that problem.
Thank you. Doctor, please.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good question. In Iraq, in general, we have millions of widows and orphans because of the internal and external wars of the country, and because of the events we had since 2003 also. A lot of widows are there also after 2003. I'm afraid to say that they are not well looked after. In Kurdistan, they are in a better situation because there is peace in Kurdistan, there is stability in the region, in the Kurdistan region. But in the rest of Iraq, in general, we in the Iraqi parliament, we have discussed this many times. There are even laws about helping these individuals more and more, but I'm afraid that they are not well looked after, because although Iraq is a rich country, but because of corruption, because of political conflicts, because of all the problems you hear day and night from Iraq, I think the government may be busy with other things. It's unfortunate that these people are not well looked after. They have the right to be looked after, and they are all victims of the unjustified wars. Thank you.
Next question. There's a chap at the back with his hand up, please.
My name is Koya Rauf. I am one of the survivors who survived in Halabja in 1988. And I lost 4 members of my relatives. And I am also working with the organization in United Kingdom called CHAC organization, Kurdish Genocide. I am head of that, the organization in United Kingdom. You all talked about everything, apart from one thing, that the murders who escaped Iraq and they went to somewhere else. I would like to ask you about those murders. Two of the murders of Halabja and Anfal operation are fled to United Kingdom. One of them, a pilot named Tariq Muhammad Ramadan, who participated in bombardment of Halabja in 1988. The other one was Tariq Wafiq al-Samarai, who is live in United Kingdom freely. He's responsible for the Anfal operation. So please make sure to take them to the crime court in Iraq or Lahai or United Kingdom. Please answer my question. Are you going to take them to Iraq or Lahai or somewhere else to pay their price for the crime which did against humanity? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm going to pass that question on to Peter to answer, but before I do, I just want to assure you, sir, that British parliamentarians, I'm not a minister, I'm just what's called a backbench parliamentarian, are well aware that there are perpetrators who are living possibly in the United Kingdom and in the rest of Europe, and we have been lobbying hard for these people to be brought to justice. But Peter, if you'd like to comment.
I served on the board of an organization called Indict that actually was chaired by Anne Clewid, who was and perhaps still is a member of Parliament, and was funded significantly by the U.S. State Department. This was before the war in 2003, and the object was to collect evidence on Iraq, people who had committed crimes in Iraq. Initially, we targeted the top leadership. And it was part of a strategy of either, as in Spain, bringing cases against people who have committed major crimes. It's also possible to pursue them through civil remedies, lawsuits, and that's been done in the United States against some of the perpetrators of atrocities in South and Central America. So I think there are options, and the notion in the 21st century that you can leave your country, like Baby Doc Duvalier and some of these earlier tyrants, and have immunity for the rest of your life, or impunity, that no longer exists. So I think there are a range of options that can be pursued. I would like to also come back to an earlier question and really reference what was said in the film, because this book that was presented, you may remember from the film, The Name of the Villages. I remember Sami and Mam Jalal in 1988, April 1988, bringing that book with the list of villages, and it kept being expanded, the date of deportation, the location. And his other point, which is one that rings very true to me, is the accounts from the survivors, who were significantly women and children. You know, we have an idea that we need to have hard evidence, and that hard evidence is somehow forensic evidence. Well, that's useful, that's important. It also comes many years after the fact, when you can actually get into a place where atrocities have taken place. To me, the hard evidence is the consistent statements of the survivors. Now, maybe one account you can imagine might be exaggerated or fraudulent, although that's really very unlikely. But when you have thousands of accounts, when they match up, that is incredibly reliable, and yet in the West, and somehow in our system of, as we think about these, is written in the press, and this was asked of me because I interviewed the survivors, we had the documentation. Well, do you have any hard evidence? In fact, this came up at a press conference that Senator Pell had when we did our report, basically based on the evidence of the survivors of these attacks into Hawk Governorate. And he said, well, what do you want? They didn't bring back a corpse. But that's unnecessary.
Sir, Doctor.
Yeah. Well, I think our friend from Halabja, what he wanted is very clear. This is a demand by many people in Kurdistan and in Iraq also. Many people who were accused or asked by the High Criminal Court to be brought to just ask them questions and so on. They are at large. Some of them are outside. Some of them are even in Kurdistan, free. That's why I think we have asked many times, and many NGO organizations have asked, that these people should be brought to trial. If the court asks for them, they should be brought before the court, and justice should be done on them, whether they are criminals or not. Thank you.
We have time for one very, very quick question and a very quick answer. I think, so you're at the back with the, in the middle there with a stripy tie. No, I'm sorry, behind you. Several stripy ties, but yeah.
Thank you. Haider Sultan.
Very quickly, sir.
Sorry, yeah. Haider Sultan, a survivor of Kurdish failure in Baghdad in 1980. 4 members of my family has been put in prison in 1980 till 87. I would like to thank Dr. Osman for marginally mentioned our case, which all the speaker has just forget to mention about. The Kurdish failure case, which is being...
Sir, well, can I ask you to sum up your question?
Yeah, whether there's a clear case through the whole case of the Kurdish genocide, will be that put part of the actual crime will be recognized, because I feel here very much of the speakers has mentioned that. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, Peter is going to just answer. So just because we've got
okay, just to be brief, for those who may not know, the Faili Kurds were the Shiite Kurds who were stripped of citizenship, many of them as Iranians, many of them sent to Iran, and then also subject to killings and part of the genocide. First, this took place earlier than the Untold, by and large, and so and it took parts of Iraq that were not liberated after '91. So on both counts, the evidence was simply what was available on the outside was less, and the amnesia, the forgetting about it, continues. But I think you raise an absolutely important point. It's worth raising. I just have one other point that I'd like to make, which is, unfortunately, this whole process was short-circuited by the execution of Saddam Hussein after the Dujail incident, which basically left the impression, which I think is a correct impression, that the execution was a Shiite revenge for a terrible incident, but one that involved a few hundred. And it took place while the Untold trial was still in progress. And so the much larger genocide, and the one that affected the non-Arab group, there never was an accounting. And I think that really raises a question about the value of Iraqi jurisprudence, that it was political, and that I mean, I was very much involved. I served in Bosnia, Croatia, Bosnia during the war, and one of the things, and was part of the Dayton peace process, in fact, that created your organization. And what we felt was so key was to do what had not happened in 1945 in that part of the world, where the things were, there was killings, revenge killings, and then it was washed over, to have genuine justice. And genuine justice is the basis of peace. Okay. And that is what, unfortunately, has not happened here, and certainly above all in the case of the Faili Kurds.
I'm sorry there's no more time for questions this session because we're about to move to the next session, but I'm enormously grateful to the panel for everything that has occurred this morning thus far. And could I ask you to please to give the panel another round of applause in the traditional way. Thank you.